when we deputized the national security state in 1947 with the National Security Act and with NSC 10-2 to be able to do, a license to do anything, in Pompeo's words, a license to lie, cheat, or steal. That was because we recognized it's a big, bad world out there. And we may need a Department of Dirty Tricks to take on, as George Kennan put it in his 1948 memo, the inauguration of organized political warfare. The whole thing was, listen, we need a Department of Dirty Tricks because if we don't, the Bolsheviks will, and they'll win the 21st century, yada, yada. Okay, understood. But there has to be a firewall on the foreign and domestic, which means ending the laundering systems that happen right now. There's about
and it's pretty straightforward, right? It's you can't do this to American citizens, but you can do this to non-Americans.
Right.
We have a category of who you're not allowed to do this stuff to.
Right. But the laundering process has to be exposed and prohibited, frankly, both at the appropriations level and I think at a regulatory level as well, which is, you've got this example, for example, the Pentagon. You got a very strange political constellation of pieces right now on the political chessboard where you've got, in 2016, you had a sort of Bernie Sanders populist left and a Donald Trump populist right. And there were sort of two threats to traditional Pentagon brass on the foreign policy side. You had this sort of populist right who wanted to reappropriate sort of foreign policy establishment funds and DoD funds for nationalist objectives, manufacturing, sort of, just a number of domestic initiatives. And then you had the Bernie Sanders left, which said, okay, we're going to take Pentagon funding and we're going to reappropriate for universal health care and free college and whatnot. The Bernie Sanders left has been completely crushed at the political level. I mean, there's vestiges of it in the media through media figures like Jimmy Dore and Max Blumenthal and those folks. But at the political level, every single one of the squad members and Bernie have completely fallen in line with party leadership on the Dem side. That's not true on the Republican side. One of the compromises that Kevin McCarthy was essentially persuaded, we'll say, to agree to for the speaker battle was a $75 billion cut to the Pentagon. Well, lo and behold, who are the top political targets of the censorship mercenary groups who are being funded by the Pentagon? It's all Freedom Caucus people. So the Pentagon gives government grants and contracts to groups like Graphica, to groups like NewsGuard, to groups like Omelas, to groups like the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab. Those are all Pentagon funded. Now, and who are their targets, though? Their targets are Trump supporters. All 21 of the top 21 repeat misinformation spreaders identified by Graphica and the Atlantic Council's DFR lab, both of them get millions of dollars in Pentagon funding. I think $7 million for Graphica over the past couple of years, $2 million from the Atlantic Council. The Pentagon says, oh, well, they're helping us deal with mis and disinformation from Russia and Iran. But they're not giving it to a separate side business that they're running. They're turning around and using that. Their business models they don't need to make a dime on censoring your website because their money is coming from the Pentagon on the foreign side. This would be like if what if it wasn't NewsGuard who was censoring your website? It was Raytheon. Raytheon would dissolve overnight if the U.S. Department of Defense stopped buying Raytheon missiles. But if Raytheon opened up a domestic censorship shop to censor critics of the Pentagon or the political faction associated with reducing the Pentagon's budget, you would say that's not fair. Raytheon's basically a government cutout. It's my taxpayers who are paying for Raytheon. Doesn't need to build a business model censoring me online. Their business model is selling missiles to the national security state. This is being done in a dozen different ways in DoD alone, and then you add on the State Department's role in this laundering process, U.S. aid. You have tens of millions of dollars. I've documented over 100 million from the whole of government, but that is going to subsidize domestic censorship that is laundered through this sort of, foreign predicate for the most part. Some of it just is straight up domestic. The National Science Foundation, DHS, CISA, didn't even use that sophisticated laundering predicate. But what the next U.S. president has to do And if Biden is so inclined, this is a bipartisan issue.
Hey, I said free speech president.
Right, exactly. Is to seal back shut what should have been, there should have been gorilla glue on the Pandora's box about the foreign Department of Dirty Tricks that we use here. That thing there should have been nails on that thing to nail that down. That Pandora's box has been opened up. And if you shut that down, you will handicap the censorship industry in ways that are existential to its very existence.
One of the things you've been saying this entire time is speaking candidly that a lot of this stuff is basically just directed at Trump supporters, right? And I like that for similar reasons as when we're talking about affirmative action, people contort themselves into all sorts of pretzel shapes to pretend like it isn't what it is, which is anti-white straight male. Like that's functionally, and I think that sometimes in the free speech industry, and there definitely is a free speech Inc. out there, people love to pretend like this is a bipartisan issue. There's left-wing censorship and there's right-wing censorship. Do you think that's right? That there's any sort of bipartisan aspect to it, or is it primarily overwhelmingly targeted towards one side of the political aisle? So,
I would say yes to both of the ways that you phrase that. I absolutely see this as being bipartisan, but in a way that's nuanced that I'd like to explain, which is to say that you had these threats. I mentioned the targeting of early Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, who had a sort of what was perceived as a sort of anti-NATO stance, again from a sort of left-wing socialist perspective. The reason, as I see it, that Trump supporters have been disproportionately targeted is because they've been disproportionately politically successful. It's not just Trump supporters in the U.S. It's also the right-wing populist parties. And a lot of this started when I mentioned the origin of this in 2014. Yeah, and then one of the reasons NATO entered the censorship industry so early was because after Brexit happened, there was a fear that Frexit was going to happen in France with Marine Le Pen, Italexit was going to happen with Matteo Salvini in Italy, Grexit was going to happen in Greece, Spexit was going to happen with the Vox Party in Spain. The whole EU was going to fall apart, so therefore NATO was going to fall apart, so therefore the entire rules-based international order was going to fall apart.
Oh no!
Right, sure. But those threats were perceived as primarily they were targeting right-wing populists. But actually, if you look at the period between Brexit and the 2016 election, you can go back and you can see Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who was the former head of NATO, basically positing Jeremy Corbyn as the big bad, boogeyman that they feared the political success of. At that time, this is still 5 months before the U.S. election. They didn't think Trump was even had a chance. The real threat was like left-wing populist parties, many of whose websites have been deplatformed because of their foreign policy stance. A lot of this came to a head around the Syria, boots on the ground, sort of NATO having to deal with this left flank from a lot of sort of anti-imperialist left-wing folks who were pushing back on the political support for military operations in Syria. But the reason you do have such disproportionate, in my assessment, targeting of Trump supporters is because Trump actually won. Bernie didn't win. Corbyn didn't win. They were stopped before they got to that point. If they were to get in power, I suspect you would have something similar to what was done to left-wing parties in power that underwent the kind of national security state induced destabilization efforts during the Cold War. And by the way, I don't think that any self-respecting conservative wants to win, by the technique that has been used against them in this case.
Yeah.
If I disagree with Bernie Sanders on universal health care or free college or whatever, I don't want to win because we've sealed every Bernie supporter's mouth shut. You want to win because you've won over hearts and minds, not because you win by default by depriving your. I mean, I liken it to a sort of thummy war. There's no honor in winning using a trick when you use your index finger. But that's what was done here, and the universal thump will get passed around on this. Anytime when Bernie Sanders ran against Joe Biden in late 2019, you saw how quickly they invoked Russia support for Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie bent the knee quickly. Bernie lived up to the meme about him not having any backbone. Trump did not. But the day will come when left-wing populists persevere into the political sphere, when they're able to stand up to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer at the congressional level, to the extent that they ride into power one day on the force of some of the cultural figures who are fairly influential right now. I could totally see this exact apparatus being used with equal heavy-handedness on them. It just so happens it's our time in the it's the time of people, and I say this in the sense that this is a conservative setting, and I was obviously a Republican political appointee, but no one should have this kind of power. I mean, this is how you get a one-party state. This is how you get total civil-military fusion, with respect to the government and the private sector, and this is a new thing. It is in somewhere between its infancy and its adolescence. If it can be stopped before maturity, then we can save the moment of freedom that the free and open internet represented during its golden age.